Hello everybody, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm Brian Stuart, and in this lesson, we're looking at Social Studies Book 3, Lesson 14. And Lesson 14 is about our Earth, where we live. So in this lesson, we will learn about the different parts of the globe, and we will also learn about different areas on Earth. So let's get started. Okay, we always start with our vocabulary section, and the first word in the vocabulary section is region. Region. Region is the same as an area. It's an area that has shared characteristics. Shared characteristics, what does that mean? Characteristics are qualities or things that you can say about something. Adjectives are usually used to describe characteristics. For example, if someone is tall, that is a characteristic about that person. If we talk about regions or areas and we say, it's rainy there a lot, that is a characteristic. So shared characteristics means that it's an area that the characteristics are true for the whole area. And we can see that if we look at this map. For example, the Southwest in America. What are some things that are shared in this region? Well, it's characterized by deserts. It's dry, it's hot. It doesn't snow during the winter. Those are characteristics that's shared by the entire region. And you can see that the region is divided into states: Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, and Oklahoma. And those areas do share those same characteristics. We use the same adjectives to describe all of those different states. Those states comprise or make up one region. And of course, we have the different regions divided here. You can divide a country by region. You can divide the world by regions. And that's kind of what we're talking about in this lesson. Another word that's important for this lesson is geography. Geography is the study and research of the Earth's surface. Now here's a little word to remember this by: geo. Geo is what we call a prefix. A prefix comes before the base word, or what we call the root word, and geo means earth. So whenever you see a word that starts with geo, you know that they're talking about the earth. For example, geography. Geography is the study and research and making maps of the Earth's surface. Geology is the study of the Earth. So geo means earth. Okay, good. Our next word, cardinal directions. Cardinal just here means basic or basic directions. Cardinal directions are the four basic, right? Cardinal and basic are similar. The four basic directions of north, south, east, and west. I did that for me. That was opposite for you, right? For you, I think east is that way and west is that way, right? For me, east is that way, so it flips around. But north and south, okay? So those are the four cardinal directions. In other words, the four basic directions. There are other directions, of course. You can combine them, right? If you go in this direction, you're going northeast, right? By the way, it's interesting. If you go this way, it's north-northeast, right? So those are not cardinal directions. Those are getting more complicated, right? The four basic directions, north, south, east, west. But when we talk about which direction you should go, sometimes people say, go north-northeast or go south-southwest, for example. And that's in between those four cardinal directions. Okay. Intermediate directions, that's what I just talked about, right? Directions between the cardinal directions. And we see that on this map. Northeast, northwest, southwest, and southeast. Those are the intermediate directions. Intermediate, they come in between the four cardinal directions. And as I said before, you also have you can also break it down even more specifically and say northeast, east, right? So you can also do that, okay, to be more specific. So cardinal directions and intermediate directions. The equator. Do you live near the equator? The equator is the middle of the earth. If you think about the earth as a big basketball, right? Going around in space. The line that goes around the center, right? At the very middle of that basketball, we call that the equator. Okay, now that's an interesting idea. It's not real. Of course, if you go there, you won't see a line on the ground. That's kind of crazy, but it's an imaginary line. When we think about our environment, as human beings, we like to divide things. We like to measure things. We like to give names to certain features of our environment, of our surroundings. And so we have given the imaginary idea of an equator. It's an imaginary line around the middle of the earth. And it goes like this. And you'll notice that it's interesting. It's not straight up and down, right? Because the earth, as we learned in a science lesson before, is actually tilted. So the line will go around like this, but it's at the fattest part of the earth. You could say that. Because the earth isn't actually a perfectly round sphere. It's kind of fat around the middle because of the way it spins, okay? And the gravity that's exerted on it. So it kind of bulges out a little bit at the middle. But at that area, we call it the equator. And the equator separates the north and the south part of the earth. So if you are north of the equator, you are in the northern hemisphere. South of the equator, you're in the southern hemisphere. We'll see those ideas again. Now, on the pole, that is as far away from the equator as you can get. There are two poles, of course, right? There's only one equator because there's only one middle, but the poles are at the top and the bottom of the earth, okay? So the pole is the most northern or southern points of the earth, okay? And it's interesting because it says here the most northern or southern points of the earth. That's one way to look at the North Pole and the South Pole, because there are different poles, actually. There is the magnetic pole, and then there is the physical North Pole, the actual top of the earth, and they're different. The magnetic North Pole is quite far off from the actual most northern point or the top of the globe. Okay, so that's interesting. But the pole, we say the North Pole and the South Pole. They're as far away from the equator as you can get. To divide. Divide is to separate into two parts. Here we have a picture of a piece of bread, sandwich bread it looks like. And if you kind of tear it apart, you got to be careful. I would use a knife, but anyway, if you don't have a knife, you just tear it apart carefully. You divide it. One for you, one for me. That's to share. Now, you don't always divide things to share them. The equator divides the earth into two parts. I said the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. The equator will divide or to separate a thing, whether it's the earth or a piece of bread. You divide it, you separate it into two parts. Okay. Hemisphere. Now, as I said, we're going to talk about this in a little bit. So the northern hemisphere, as I said, here is the equator, right? This line here is the equator. Now we have the northern hemisphere. Anything north of that line is in the northern hemisphere, okay? And anything south of this line is the southern hemisphere. Hemi means half. Sphere is a three-dimensional round ball. So hemisphere is half of that, right? It's the top half. The northern half of that, the northern hemisphere. And again, for the southern hemisphere, same idea, right? The southern half sphere is basically what we're saying. So it's the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. Hemisphere, hemi, half of the sphere. Hemi is half, right? And it's right here, actually. A half of the earth that is cut according to the equator. Again, the equator is the dividing line. It is the line that divides north from south. Okay. Okay, those are our words for today. Let's talk about the main ideas for this unit. And the first main idea is the parts of a globe. We've already discussed some of these already when we were discussing vocabulary. And as we saw, we can see the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. So those are, two important parts of a globe. Of course, another part is the equator. Now, what are the characteristics of these different regions? Well, first of all, the equator. If you live on or near the equator, the regions around the equator, your climate is probably quite warm. It might rain a lot, right? Depending on where you live. You might live in a rainforest, or you might live in a desert, right? Regions around the equator are warm. There are many kinds of plant and animal life. Now, that's also very interesting if we think about biology, because around the equator, right, this region around the equator, it's not just the equator, but it's also, hundreds of kilometers north of the equator and hundreds of kilometers south of the equator. That is where most of the diverse species live. Why? Because it's warm, there's lots of water, and there's more sunlight, more chances for plant and animal growth. So the most diversity of animal species is around the equator. There are many kinds of plant and animal life. The further north you go, the number of animal species declines, okay? North and South Pole. The North and South Pole regions, we're talking about these areas. These are the North Pole and the South Pole regions. Of course, they're very cold, right? Animals in the polar regions have thick fur. So, of course, you've heard of polar bears, right? Polar bears have very thick fur, and they run around up there. Now, there are no polar bears in the southern pole, but there are penguins. Penguins don't have thick fur, but they do have thick feathers, right? And they have thick skin that keeps them warm. So animals at the North and the South Pole have to develop some sort of natural coat, right, to keep them warm and to keep their body heat next to their body. Each region on Earth has its own landforms and climates, right? As we talked about before, around the equator, it's warm. Depending on whether you live in the desert or the rainforest, it could rain a whole lot, or maybe it doesn't rain at all. That's different climate. Of course, in the North and South Poles, it snows a lot. There's a lot of snow. There's a lot of ice. So they have their own climate. They also have their own landforms. In the North Pole, the true North Pole, there's no land. It's just ice, but it kind of forms like a land. But it's melting. Every year it seems to melt more and more. In the wintertime, though, it is covered with ice. In the South Pole, as you know, there's a continent, Antarctica, right? And that has, so that is land. Even if all the ice melted on Antarctica, which we hope it doesn't, there would still be land there. Okay, interesting. Another idea from this unit is that there are different kinds of regions. And I talked about this just a little bit just on the previous idea, right? We talked about tropical regions. A tropical region, I mentioned rainforests. These are near the equator. You see them in places like South America. A very famous tropical region is along the Amazon River. It's not at the equator. It's south of the equator, but it's kind of close. And this area gets a lot of rain. There's a lot of vegetation, a lot of plants. And of course, if there's a lot of plants, there's a lot of animals that can use those plants for food and shelter. So like I said, near the equator, the animal species, the number and quantity of animal species rises quite a lot. Now there's also a desert region. Desert regions have no rain or very little rain. It rains, but not very often. It's very dry, and strange plants grow, right? That's a saguaro, right? That's a cactus, a type of cactus that can grow very tall, taller than your house, and they're very heavy, but they hold water inside of them. So that's a desert region. Polar region, of course, polar, we're talking about the poles, North Pole, South Pole. It's very cold. There's a lot of ice. There's a lot of snow. And you need to have warm clothing if you're at the North or South Pole, because it's very, very cold. Brr. I get cold just looking at the picture. Also, we could say there's a mountain region, right? So it's not just climates, it could also be landforms, mountains, valleys. Well, desert is usually flat, but you could have deserts high up in the mountains too. But a mountain region is just an area characterized by many mountains. The Andes mountain range running through South America. It's also the Rocky Mountains running through the western United States. And of course, the Alps running through Switzerland, very famous. So these are mountain regions. Can't forget the Himalayas, right? Very famous mountain region. Okay, so those are different kinds of regions on the earth. Now it's time for the reading section. So as always, read along with me in your head or read it along out loud, practice the pronunciation, and remember the words that we talked about. Okay, you ready? Here we go. Our Earth has many different regions. Each region on Earth has its own landforms, climate, and plant life. You can see the differences in geography lessons. Traveling in cardinal and intermediate directions, you can see changes in the land forms. The Earth is divided into the northern and southern hemispheres by the equator. A hemisphere is the half of the Earth. Northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere. Okay. The equator gets a lot of sunlight all year round. Therefore, around the equator, the climate is warm, and there are many kinds of animal and plant life. There are many kinds of plant and animal life. Okay. But the South and North Pole regions do not get much sunlight, and the climate is very cold. Okay. In these regions, animals need thick fur to protect themselves from the cold. The climate is cold, and there is not a lot of plant or animal life. Okay. Let's talk about the organization of the information in the reading. And in this case, we are using the organizational pattern of compare and contrast. Now, when we talked about the globe, we talked about two main regions, right? We talked about the equator, that's at the middle of the Earth, and we talked about the polar regions. So we can divide those regions and compare and contrast those. Compare is when you say how things are similar. Contrast is when you say how things are different. Of course, in this reading passage, we mostly talked about how these two areas are different. So let's take a look at it. Around the equator, the climate is what? It's warm. The climate is warm because, as they said, it gets a lot of sunlight. The equator is always, actually the daytime, the amount of sun and night is usually the same around the equator. You usually get about 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours of night. But at the poles, sometimes you get a lot of sunlight, but sometimes you get no sunlight at all, depending on the season and what pole you're at. So, in the North and South poles, the climate is cold, very cold. Okay. So that's the difference. That's the main difference. The climate is warm around the equator. The climate is cold around the North and South poles. What is that effect? What's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is that there are many kinds of plant and animal life around the equator. And there is not a lot of plant or animal life around the South or North poles. There's not a lot of them. Okay? So each region on Earth has its own landforms, climate, and plant life. Landforms. And landforms, like we talked about, deserts, tropical areas, polar regions, mountainous regions. These are landforms. So each region on Earth has its own landforms, climate, and plant life, and of course, animal life as well. Okay, well, that wraps up our lesson for today. It's interesting to think about that. What kind of region do you live on the earth? Do you live near the equator, or are you further north or further south? I don't think you live in the polar regions. Not many people do. But hopefully you live in a nice climate. You can enjoy the outdoors. And of course, when you get older, or even now, if your parents agree, you can take trips to different parts of the earth and see the different landforms, the different plant life, and the different types of climate by yourself. Okay, so that would be like a little adventure, something to look forward to. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed studying with me, and we'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.